We hope you'll enjoy listening to Bauhaus, a conceptual model in the Art to Hear series.
You have to refrain from trying to solve a new brief with conventional forms. Instead of that, the corresponding form has to be distilled from the essence of the new task at hand. This statement by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe is manifest in his unusual design for a high-rise building at Friedrichstrasse in Berlin. One of the corners leans like the bow of a ship towards the street. The 20-story building appears forceful yet delicate, thanks to its facade, which is made entirely of glass. Reflections from the glazing were to serve in place of ornamentation. Extending deep into the building are huge expanses of flexible, open-plan office space. Mies entered his design for the Wabe, meaning honeycomb, skyscraper, in an ideas competition run by the Turmhaus Company in 1921. It must have seemed utterly utopian to his contemporaries. Unsurprisingly, the competition jury rejected the design by the 35-year-old architect, who until then had designed only private houses, as too imprecise and, above all, too unusual. Mies continued to refine the design, producing new drawings that he submitted a few months later in 1922 for Berlin's most important open art exhibition. In spite of that, the high-rise project never progressed beyond the design stage. Nevertheless, in the honeycomb, Mies had presented his ideal of a skyscraper, one that has lost nothing of its modernity to this day. Glass, which had never before been used so extravagantly as a building material, was eventually to become the symbol par excellence of the early Bauhaus. It perfectly symbolizes the much-invoked new spirit of clarity and purity.
We see 3 spires on the roofs of the nave and aisles, each with a star at its tip. Their rays merge, seeming to form one joint roof for the cathedral's otherwise loosely connected structures. Lines also extend from the building itself, creating a dense network of intersecting diagonals. Lionel Feininger's Cathedral adorns the front page of a leaflet of great importance. This is the manifesto written by Walter Gropius in 1919, in which he outlines his vision of a renewal of the arts and presents the program of the newly founded Staatliches Bauhaus in Weimar. The woodcut is a perfect visual response to Gropius's demand.
Let us desire, conceive and create the new building of the future together. It will combine architecture, sculpture and painting in a single form, and will one day rise towards the heavens from the hands of a million workers as the crystalline symbol of a new and coming faith.
Then, 36 years old, the architect had nothing less in mind than the total work of art once propagated in the age of Romanticism. All of the fine arts were to work together, whereby Gropius assigned a leading role to the art of building. As an example, he took the Gothic cathedrals, created by the combined efforts of medieval stonemasons' lodges in which artists and craftsmen had worked side by side. Soon after the Bauhaus Manifesto appeared, around 150 students registered for the courses in Weimar. Nearly half of them were women. They'd not been attracted merely by the up-to-date curriculum and Feininger's modern-looking woodcut. Gropius had tapped into the energetic mood of a new generation of young people who wanted a radically new approach to rebuilding a Germany that had been crippled by the First World War.
At the moment, I'm waiting for my glass tower, which can arrive at any moment.
The glass tower made for the Swiss painter Johannes Itten by a stained glass company in Weimar in 1920 was eagerly awaited by its designer. Itten taught at the Bauhaus in Weimar from 1919 to 1923 as head of the preliminary course. This course was obligatory for all students, and even for the artistic directors of several of the school's workshops, including that for glass painting. In addition, Itten developed a theory of contrast and colour. Immediately after taking up his position in 1919, Itten, then 31, began to work on the most important artistic project of his time at the Bauhaus. He once described the glass spiral as a landmark of a town for pilots, which led to the supposition that the Tower of Light, as he also called it, was planned as a navigation landmark for an airport in Weimar. The glass tower was the three-dimensional development of the coloured spiral pictures that Itten had been painting since 1916. It consisted of 12 cubes, each smaller than the one below it, stacked and rotated to create a spiral. The lowest 4 cubes represented stone, the middle 4 metal, and the uppermost 4 glass. They form the structural core for 48 coloured elements made of lead glass. In addition, a total of 12 Asian temple bells were mounted on the 3rd, 4th and 5th levels, 4 on each level. Itten's Tower of Fire is the perfect complement to the other landmarks of the New Age, the skyscraper and the cathedral, likewise symbolising the attempt to achieve a total work of art. At the same time, Itten was trying to place his reflections on the philosophy and theory of art in the context of an overall worldview. The Tower of Fire was therefore not only a novel sculpture using light, space and sound, but also an attempt to represent the world in its totality.
The 18th of May was a special day at the Bauhaus. It was Walter Gropius's birthday. Among the presents given to the director by the other Bauhaus masters on his 41st birthday was this portfolio of small artworks. It contained different variations on a newspaper photograph, which each contributor had reworked artistically in his own way. The photos showed a crowd listening to the announcement on public radio loudspeakers of the results of the German parliamentary election of the 4th of May 1924.
Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who'd thought up the idea of this present, breaks the scene down into a constructivist composition. The radio has been turned into a red square, and the loudspeaker into an orange circle. The shapes mediate between the foreground and background of the picture, thus expressing the idea of radio as a mass medium.
Paul Klee takes an interpretive approach. A red arrow symbolises the message. Beyond the ear appears a green exclamation mark. Although the message has reached its destination, it has obviously turned into its opposite, as suggested by the use of the complementary colours red and green. Klee's picture therefore shows a failed attempt to communicate information.
Oskar Schlemmer reduces the radio and the ear to their respective structures. The numbers next to them turn the relationship of electrical device and human organ into a formula, 1 × 1 = 1. The broadcaster and the receiver thus form a unity. This might be a reference to Walter Gropius's new slogan in which he invoked the unity of art and technology. In the subtext, however, Schlemmer seems to be making a criticism. Since 1 × 1 = only 1, the process cannot be said to be very productive.
Wassily Kandinsky, who could hear colours and see musical tones, was especially keen on making the invisible visible. For him, the colour yellow signified loudness, aggression and explosiveness. The bundle of lines from the yellow triangle continues in spite of the barriers cutting across their path. The diagonal impetus finally dissipates at the top left in a system of quietly floating circles which symbolise the listening multitude.
Georg Mucha resolves the hard contrast of the original photo into bright and colourful elements. He's the only one of the masters to place the radio set and the listeners in a direct relationship with one another. The momentum emanates less from the loudspeaker than from the black, grey and coloured circles that represent the listeners. Together they build up an advancing energy that seems almost unsettling.
Lionel Feininger turns the windowsill into a sheet of water, the radio into a ship, and the loudspeaker into a plume of smoke. The window frame has been transformed into cliffs. It is quite possible that Feininger wanted to express his skepticism towards technology here. Take a look at the ship. It is steaming at full speed towards the base of the cliff. Could it be that Feininger saw the Bauhaus heading for a similar collision?
Indeed, 1924 was to be the Bauhaus's last year in Weimar. After the right-wing parties won power in the state of Thuringia, political and financial support was withdrawn from the Bauhaus. The school had to search for a new location in which to carry on its work. Johannes Itten was, without a doubt, among the most influential of the masters to leave their mark on the early Bauhaus. The preliminary course that he created proved to be an indispensable foundation for the school's educational work. It was his aim
to build people up in their entirety as creative beings.
In order to do this, he thought that the physical, sensory, spiritual and intellectual powers should combine to an equal extent. Itten studied Eastern philosophy and early Christianity, also joining the Mazdaznan sect, which drew on the ancient Persian teachings of Zarathustra, among others. Some of this he sought to incorporate in his teaching at the school. His classes focused on three main areas: nature and materials studies, colour and form studies, and analyses of the old masters, which you see here. The latter involved making drawings based on an original work in which various ways of looking at it were tried out: the interpretation of line and colour, geometrical analysis, and finally the presentation of the piece in words. Itten would insert sentences such as,
"To experience a work of art is to recreate it." Itten suggested that during our walks we search for material in rubbish heaps, refuse dumps, trash cans and scrapyards, which should then be used to construct forms that would clearly demonstrate the essential and opposing properties of each material.
That's how Johannes Itten's methods were described by one of his students, Alfred Arndt. Another student who completed the preliminary course was Moses Mirkin, who made his piece Contrast Study with Diverse Materials in the winter semester of 1921-22. Here Mirkin combines the partly fibrous and partly smooth wood of an old plank with soft leather, smooth metal and brittle glass. He pays attention not only to the material's contrasting properties, but also to the combination of different shapes, such as flat surfaces and points, as well as the plate, cylinder, and spiral. Following Itten's teachings, he also juxtaposes further contrasting pairs: large and small, long and short, broad and narrow, black and white, light and heavy, transparent and opaque. Gropius, in contrast to Itten, insisted that the preliminary course should include training in handicrafts, and he wanted the workshops to carry out commercial work. In the end, this proved incompatible with Itten's approach to teaching, which took a holistic view of the individual, and so, in 1923, Itten left the Bauhaus.
Otto Werner's limestone architectural sculpture, dating from 1922, is one of the few objects made in the stone carving workshop to have survived. Werner produced it as his journeyman piece. Even the title reflects the early Bauhaus vision of uniting art and craft under the aegis of architecture. Indeed, Werner has succeeded masterfully here in combining figurative forms with architectural and geometrical elements. Even as Werner's sculpture was taking shape, the sculpture workshops at the Bauhaus were in crisis. On one hand, sculpture was not envisaged as a free art in its own right. Gropius had disparaged it as salon art in his manifesto. On the other hand, the workshops were given hardly any opportunity of doing work for incorporation into architectural projects. An exception to this was the chance to create the wall relief sculptures for the Bauhaus exhibition in Weimar in 1923, which adorned the vestibule of the school building and the entrance and staircase of the workshop building. In the very same year that Werner carved his architectural sculpture, Gropius began changing the goals and the structure of the Bauhaus workshops. From now on, they were meant to design and produce household utensils for serial production. This new approach, based on functionality, ultimately reduced the importance to the Bauhaus of free artistic work and pieces such as Werner's.
The last thing you'd think of while looking at Frank Scala's enchantingly beautiful painting The Dream is that it was created at the Weimar Bauhaus in 1919. A rather conventional composition with cubist nuances, it's packed with metaphors, puzzles, and symbols. A sleeping woman is resting in an undefined space with a golden sphere in her hand. Words are integrated in the picture as if this were a matter of course. Towards the bottom left, the word Geburt, meaning birth, is written near an open blossom. The dark bud next to it, at which a small rodent seems to be gnawing, signifies the prenatal stage as it's still closed. Above the sleeper's back, we find the word Traum, meaning dream. At the top right, against a blue background, there is Sehnsucht, meaning yearning. And finally, next to several box-like houses at the bottom right, we can read Sterben, meaning dying. Here another figure lies in wait. A cat, its claws outstretched, fixes its gaze on the rodent, which seems to be completely unaware of it. We know better, though. Its fate is sealed. This dream piece just invites interpretation. Perhaps Scala intended to paint nothing less than the cycle of life, including birth, dreaming, yearning, and death, a smooth transition without any horrors, apparently reconciled in the peacefully slumbering figure. On the other hand, it might be meant as a literal depiction of a specific dream of this particular sleeping woman. The Dream is among Scala's most important pictures. At 27 years of age, he'd come to the Weimar Bauhaus from Vienna shortly beforehand as one of Johannes Itten's retinue. Alongside Otto Werner's architectural sculpture, this painting is an early example of how individual artistic styles developed at the Bauhaus.
In 1920, Walter Gropius initiated a student competition in which students were asked to design badly needed accommodation and workspaces for the Bauhaus in Weimar. The only entry to have survived is this one by Walter Determann. His design includes not only a site plan for the entire complex, but also floor plans and elevations of the individual buildings. It represents an early contribution, albeit with the limitations of a student scheme, to the goal of the great building as propagated in Gropius's manifesto. It also embodies the utopian ideal of a Bauhaus campus, that of independent communal living, working, and mutual care. The campus, laid out rather like a heraldic shield, covers an area of some 19 hectares and provides accommodation for around 330 people. Surrounding the site is a wall with light towers at its corners. The entrance zone contains a school, a farm with administrative rooms, and the dining and assembly building. At the site's centre is a trapezoidal open-air theatre, which could also be used as a sports stadium. On the southern terrace of the stage is a central monument, the Bauhaus symbol in the form of a flaming crystal. Between the entrance zone and the theatre stands the architectural highlight, the administrative, festival and exhibition building. The housing estate consists of buildings accommodating 4 families each, together with residential and guest blocks. Behind the family homes, laid out at an angle, are the workshops. Determann's student design exercise remained just that. It was not developed further. Gropius, however, pursued the idea of the campus as a communal workplace and residence for a long time. In 1922, a Bauhaus development cooperative was founded, after which a young Hungarian architect, Fred Forbat, acting with Gropius's support, developed a concept for a Bauhaus campus in Weimar. This vision became reality in 1926 in the form of the Bauhaus building and the masters' houses in Dessau.
The African chair. Could this have been made by Bauhaus artists? In view of its expressive yet primitive vocabulary of form, that seems hardly likely. In fact, this piece of furniture was designed in 1921 by Marcel Breuer and Gunther Stölzel, and it offers us fascinating insights into the conceptual environment at the Bauhaus in its early phase. The chair has 5 legs, which are fixed with pegs to a circular seat. The outer legs at the rear extend upwards to form the back of the chair, and have been bent so that they cross one another. The wooden parts are all painted red, blue and gold, while the round seat is half red and half blue. On top of the seat lies a square cushion, which fits neatly within the circular perimeter of the seat. The archetypal forms of the square and circle have not just been used because they're characteristic of the Bauhaus. They might also be allusions to the proverbial squaring the circle, a motif that held great significance for the members of the Bauhaus at the time. This reconciling of opposites symbolizes cosmic harmony. The perfect form of the circle can be interpreted as truth or spirit, with the square as a symbol of the created real world. The chair also probably owes its unusual design to the fact that Marcel and Gunther were lovers. According to one of the esoteric teachings that enjoyed considerable popularity in the early Bauhaus, the number 3 stands for the male and the number 2 for the female. Perhaps that explains why the chair has 5 legs. By the way, this chair was originally called the Romantic Easy Chair. Only later did Marcel Breuer rename it the African chair. In any case, only 2 years after its creation, it represented a bygone era of Bauhaus history. The new maxim was art and technology, a new unity, and Breuer, as the master of the joinery workshop in Dessau, turned to constructing the tubular steel furniture with which he was to make design history.
Architects, sculptors and painters, we must all return to craft, for there is no art by profession. There is no essential difference between the artist and the craftsman. The artist is an intensification of the craftsman.
That's how Walter Gropius formulated the goals of the Bauhaus in the manifesto that he wrote for its foundation in 1919. The separation of art and craft was to be overcome in order to create objects and even spaces with an exemplary character. Peter Kehler took on this challenge in designing this cradle. He'd begun his studies at the Bauhaus in 1921 with courses in mural painting under Wassily Kandinsky and joinery under Johannes Itten. The influence of their teachings on colour, form and material are all present in his cradle of 1922. Itten in particular placed great emphasis on the correspondence between different materials, combining them in various ways so as to make opposing characteristics, and also shared ones, visible and recognisable. This is exactly what Peter Kehler has succeeded in doing with his cradle, in which wheels of bent wood encompass a plywood body which itself frames woven window openings. Each of the fundamental geometric forms is assigned a colour that suits its perceived nature. The rectangle, for example, is considered to epitomise limitation, immobility and matter. This is supposed to correspond to the colour red. The triangle is given a light colour like yellow because, as the symbol of thought, it's associated with weightlessness. The circle gives the impression of constant movement and therefore represents the mobile spirit, corresponding to the colour blue. Kehler has not just followed the formal rules, however. He's gone further by using the forms themselves in a corresponding manner. So the circle, symbolising movement, forms the component that actually makes movement possible, in this case, a rocking back and forth. The solid black wooden cylinder gives the cradle a low centre of gravity, preventing it from tipping right over. The rigorous use of form is thus inseparable from the functional aspects of the cradle. This watercolour, titled Radiance Drifting Centre, was painted in Paul Klee's course on Instruction in Visual Form in 1927. The aim of this particular exercise was to shift the compositional centre and to explore the consequences of this for the pictorial structure. Lena Meyer-Bergner, then 21, took this as an opportunity to construct a figure alive with tension and polarity, whose centre of gravity seems to keep shifting. In addition, the composition with its radiant stars also displays highly expressive symbolism. The coloured circles, traces of the drifting centre, recall the phases of the moon, while the two blue and yellow stars allude to day and night. Paul Klee counted among the most important new artists as early as 1920. He began teaching at the Bauhaus in 1921. His course on Instruction in Visual Form was compulsory for all students in their second semester. At its core was the use of compositional tools such as form, line, chiaroscuro, and colour, as well as the interplay between them. Klee developed a circular colour chart, positing a pendulum movement between the complementary colours and investigating the nuances of colour that resulted. This transformed the traditional static chromatic circle into a dynamic dialogue of colours. It was this that he sought to convey in his classes, the idea of movement and counter-movement between colours, an idea that, by the way, recurs frequently in his own work as the arrow symbol. Klee's colour and form theory had a great influence on the Bauhaus students. He also incorporated ideological, scientific and philosophical observations in his teachings without becoming dogmatic. Quite the opposite, he always encouraged his students to judge things for themselves.
A yellow triangle, a red square, and a blue circle. These three archetypal forms with their associated primary colours have become something like a brand logo for the Bauhaus. Peter Keeler used them in exactly this way in his Cradle of 1922. Here we encounter the same striking combination of form and colour in Eugen Batz's painting, Spatial Effects of Colours and Forms, from 1929-1930. Batz goes one step further, however, showing the fully blocked-in forms above, while echoing them below as coloured outlines. This gives the black background a stronger presence, acting as a fourth colour and intensifying the impression of spatial depth. The starting point, both for Keeler and Batz, was Wassily Kandinsky's colour theory, which assigned the three primary colours to the three fundamental geometrical forms. Kandinsky based his theory on the idea that each colour conveys particular sensory impressions. For Kandinsky, it followed that the effect induced by a colour could be enhanced by combining it with a certain shape. Eugen Batz began his studies at the Dessau Bauhaus in 1929. He attended the preliminary course under Josef Albers, advertising under Jost Schmidt, photography under Walter Peter Hans, analytical drawing under Wassily Kandinsky, and finally Paul Klee's free painting class, to which only selected students were admitted. In this period, Batz painted his first abstract pictures and even held his first solo exhibition at the Bauhaus. The Dutch painter and art theoretician Theo van Doesburg is considered to have co-founded abstract painting. He coined the term concrete art and founded the De Stijl movement together with the painter Piet Mondrian and other artist friends in 1917. The De Stijl artists propagated a functional art of clear geometrical forms and linear elements, using the primary colours red, blue and yellow, together with grey, black and white. In place of ornamentation and individuality, they promoted order and clarity. An excellent example of this is Van Doesburg's Rhythm of a Russian Dance, painted in 1918. The preliminary sketches show that Van Doesburg first positioned the central axis and then recorded the contours of the moving body on either side. This produced a grid of rectangles. Then he resolved the forms into lines which floated freely, creating the maximum scope of movement between them. The colour scheme for its part imparts rhythm to the movement. Black and blue represent its centres of gravity and points of stasis. The pink bars show the various positions of the moving dancer. Lastly, the yellow bars serve to balance the composition. In 1921, Van Doesburg went to Weimar, where he promoted his design principles in his lectures and classes, taking up a clear stance against the handicraft and expressionist trends within the Bauhaus. His polemics were directed at Johannes Itten in particular, who he compared to the leader of a sect. By the time that Van Doesburg left Weimar in 1923, a De Stijl faction had already crystallized among the students of the Bauhaus. Walter Gropius responded to Van Doesburg's undesirably strong influence with a new motto: Art and Technology, a New Unity. And to succeed Itten, he appointed the constructivist Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who was close to Van Doesburg. In 1922, I ordered 5 enamelled pictures by telephone from a sign manufacturer. I had the company's colour catalogue in front of me, and I sketched my pictures on layout paper. The company's foreman on the other end of the line had the same kind of squared paper lying before him. He drew the shape that I wanted exactly according to the positions that I dictated to him. One of the pictures was supplied in 3 different sizes, so that I could study the fine differences in colour relationships produced by its enlargement and reduction.
That's how the Hungarian artist Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, then 25 years old, described the process by which his telephone pictures were made, not by his own hand, but ordered from a factory. To begin with, he translated the work of art into an objective description. He then repeated this description over the phone to someone else, who was not an artist, but a technician. The latter then carried out the design on his own in different sizes. The work of art was thus reproduced mechanically, without any original object to copy. By separating design and production in this way, Moholy-Nagy created the first example of conceptual art. This was back in 1922, and it can also be described as the first work of media art in history. Moholy-Nagy was a technology enthusiast, and in 1923 he took over from Johannes Itten as head of the preliminary course and the metal workshop. His appointment was a sign that the school was abandoning its old handicraft ethos and facing up to the challenges of modern technology and industry. This lamp symbolises the design principles, the ambitions and the possibilities of the Bauhaus so perfectly that since 1928 it's been called simply the Bauhaus lamp.
A cheap, practical lighting device, beautiful in its simplicity.
These words of praise came from Wilhelm Wagenfeld's colleague at the Bauhaus, Josef Albers. Wagenfeld himself, who designed the lamp in 1923 after preliminary studies by Carl Jucker, described it thus.
The table lamp, a type for machine production, achieved the greatest possible simplicity in its form and the strictest limitation in its use of time and material. Its most important parts are a circular base, a cylindrical tube, and a spherical lampshade.
The lamp was created at a time of upheaval. Under pressure from the left-wing government of the state of Thuringia, Walter Gropius pressed ahead with a major Bauhaus exhibition which was to centre on a showcase house. The Bauhaus workshops were to provide examples of modern furniture and household utensils that could be mass-produced. In order to achieve this, The existing gold and silversmith's workshop was transformed into a metal workshop. This seemingly delicate lamp matched Gropius' vision of a high-quality, mass-produced industrial product so closely that it became the first object designed at the Bauhaus to find its way onto his own desk. In 1923, during the preparations for the first major Bauhaus exhibition, Walter Gropius wrote to the master of form at the ceramics workshop, Gerhard Marx,
"Yesterday I took a look at the many new vessels that you all have made. Nearly all of them are one-off pieces. We must find ways in which some of the pieces can be reproduced by machine."
The journeymen Theodor Bogler and Otto Lindig took up the challenge. They created experimental objects that differed more and more from handcrafted household ceramics, seeking instead an independent vocabulary of form. One example of this is Bogler's revolutionary combination teapot, based on a set of interchangeable components. The body, handle eyelets, lid, funnel and spout can be combined in many different ways. Bogler's design took the modular system that Gropius had propagated for architecture and applied it to ceramics. Of course, these objects were no longer thrown on the potter's wheel. Instead, the workshop now produced plaster models and forms for its new designs. Using the newly developed liquid stoneware casting mass, the stoneware and porcelain industry could produce them in large quantities. The ceramics workshop had thus transformed itself into a genuine laboratory for industrial product development, in spite of which it was not reopened when the Bauhaus went to Dessau, being branded as an anti-modern relic.
This building has been created for the young, for artistically talented young people who one day shall create the face of our new world.
In December 1926, with great emotion and yet greater optimism, Walter Gropius opened the new Bauhaus building in Dessau. What is in fact a complex of several buildings was built in only 13 months. Designed by Gropius himself, it's now considered a key work of modernism. Lightweight, airy and well lit, that's how Walter Gropius characterized Neues Bauen, the new approach to building. Art, life and technology were to be brought into harmony. The Bauhaus building in Dessau is a prime example of a system ultimately subordinate to the right angle that's perfectly trimmed in rational and functional respects. The architect himself described it as follows.
The building complex as a whole consists of three parts. Firstly, the wing with the Dessau Technical School. Secondly, the laboratory workshops and teaching rooms of the Bauhaus. And thirdly, the studio building. The structure bridging the road results from the requirement in the brief to build two separate school organisms, each with their own entrance.
The open plan layout, the accessible roof terrace, and the free arrangement of the walls all contribute to the building's true significance. The construction of the workshop building is especially noteworthy. The concrete floor slabs rest on mushroom columns set back from the facade. This eliminated the need for load-bearing outer walls, allowing the facade to become transparent, a continuous glass envelope on all 3 stories. This unprecedented building subsequently inspired many similar structures, both in Europe and America. After the First World War, industrial estates sprang up around Dessau, turning the town into an important economic centre within a matter of years. The population grew rapidly, and more housing became necessary. The town council commissioned Walter Gropius to design a housing project in the semi-rural Turten district of Dessau. Gropius used the project as an opportunity to set up an experimental building site on which various materials and construction methods could be tried out. His goal was nothing less than to rationalize the entire construction process. Gropius designed an estate of terraced housing with allotment gardens. Tastefulness, simplicity, and good proportions were to be the hallmarks of this new architecture, which used standardized prefabricated components. The 314 residential units had usable floor areas of between 57 and 75 square metres and came in 3 variants. These were paired as semi-detached blocks with mirrored floor plans or combined in terraces. The facades, with their white cubist aesthetic, were given a visual rhythm by window strips running vertically and horizontally. Emil Theiss's photograph shows part of the estate with the Co-op building as its functional centre. A visual focus is provided by the high-tension electricity mast. This symbolises technological progress, equated with the new and better world demanded by Gropius. In the 1960s, Gropius took a critical look back at his early architecture.
It was a mistake to prefabricate entire buildings, each of them indistinguishable from its neighbour, instead of prefabricating interchangeable components. The result was uniformity instead of unity.
Laszlo Moholy-Nagy was a highly versatile artist who sought new ways of working in painting and sculpture, photography and film. Among other things, he aimed to leave traditional pigment painting behind him and find a way of painting with light. To this end, he developed the peculiar metal construction of which you see an exact replica here. Moholy-Nagy presented it for the first time in Paris in 1930 as the light prop for an electric stage. The device later became better known as the light space modulator. It's now considered to be one of the first kinetic sculptures. The light space modulator is made from reflective chrome-plated steel, aluminium, glass and plastic. The drive unit consists of an electric motor and chain transmission, above which there's a circular base. A high frame divides this turntable into 3 sectors, each containing a mechanism that works independently of the others. The device is slowly set in motion by an electric motor, causing its individual parts to rotate, following complicated, often contrary courses. They give countless different impressions of motion, which merge to create an ever-changing whole. The effect of the movements is enhanced by the continuous play of light and shadow occurring within the device and projected onto its surroundings. Moholy-Nagy considered this at least as important as the kinetic construction itself. He recorded it in his film Light Play Black, White, Grey. This shows the machine's movements from various viewpoints and at varying speeds. It plays with positive and negative sequences, rhythmical editing, detail shots and overall views, reflection and superimposition. Here, the aesthetic of Moholy-Nagy's photographic experiments finds its logical kinetic continuation.
The Bauhaus introduced its stage class in 1921, at a time when no comparable school offered anything similar. Its first head was Lothar Schreier, who was succeeded in 1923 by the master of mural painting and sculpture, Oskar Schlemmer. Schlemmer was particularly interested in the accord and interplay between human figures and geometrical forms, between colour, sound, music, movement and material. It was at Dessau that Oskar Schlemmer at last found an opportunity to realise his conceptions of such a total work of art. He developed the so-called Bauhaus dances, such as the form dance, the gesture dance, the space dance, the stick dance, the scenery dance, and the hoop dance. The human figure is no longer the bearer of an individual expression, but is rather standardised by means of costumes and masks. The action of a piece develops solely out of compositional elements. The acoustic accompaniment of piano, percussion instruments and sound sources such as sirens or alarm clocks serves primarily to give the various movement sequences a rhythmic order. All in all, Oskar Schlemmer hoped that his extremely successful stage work would help to raise the status of purely artistic activity at the Bauhaus. In the winter semester of 1929-30, when it became clear to him this would not happen, he left the Bauhaus. With Schlemmer's departure, the Bauhaus stage class too came to an end.
Takehiko Mizutani made his material study in brass in 1928 during his second year of study at the Bauhaus. It consists of 3 circular brass discs of different sizes. In each of them he made a single radial cut, then partly rolled back the sheet metal in opposite directions on either side. The resulting elements were inserted in one another concentrically. Here Mizutani demonstrates with virtuosity how a material with rigid static properties can nevertheless be transformed by bending and assembled to create a 3-dimensional composition. Mizutani was a pupil of Josef Albers, who had taken over part of the preliminary course from Johannes Itten in 1923. Albers himself had only begun studying at the Bauhaus 2 years before that. He was the first Bauhaus graduate to join the teaching staff. He continued to head the preliminary course until the school was finally closed down in 1933. In an essay from 1928, he wrote,
"We find ourselves in an economically oriented age. The economic form results from function and material. Before determining the function, of course, the material has to be studied. Our investigations of form, therefore, begin with the study of the material."
Albers encouraged the students in his preliminary course to explore both the specific properties of a material's surface and its internal qualities. The purpose of this was to establish the possibilities and the extent of what was practicable. Mizutani's material study is a good example of the kind of 3-dimensional study that Albers recommended his students undertake. Ultimately, Mizutani went further than this. In the analytical form that he found, one that's simultaneously dynamic and elegant, he created not only a material study, but a sculpture in its own right. In 1925, the Free Sculpture Workshop was set up at the Dessau Bauhaus, a successor to the wood and stone sculpture workshops in Weimar. It was headed by a former Bauhaus student, Jost Schmidt. In parallel to the design classes given by Klee and Kandinsky, elementary courses were offered here too, but in relation to 3-dimensional design. The workshop's aim was not the creation of autonomous works of art, but rather to communicate the fundamental principles of sculptural work and to explore the interrelationships of body and space. One student, Heinz Löw, described its educational goals in the following words:
"To awaken, develop and intensify the capacity for spatial thinking, the conscious experience of spatial sensory perceptions, and the realization of spatial ideas."
In 1930, as part of their studies at the sculpture workshop, Edmund Colline and Heinz Löw assembled the apparatus that you see before you, titled From Line and Circle, Rod and Ring, to Hyperboloid and Sphere. In fact, it's a study of sculptural light effects. Elements such as the rod and the ring are rotated at various speeds so as to create the impression of a hyperboloid and sphere as virtual bodies. As simple as it is refined, this apparatus makes it possible to investigate the relationship between body and space, and their interplay with light and shadow, as well as real and virtual movement.
Perhaps it is difficult for us today to realize the radical nature of Marcel Breuer's design solutions, since we've got much too used to furniture that is ultimately based on his ideas. That is especially true of the tubular steel furniture. The club chair on display here was the first of this new type of construction. Breuer, then only 23, designed it in 1925 and 26. Conceived according to the principles of strict simplicity and objectivity, it epitomizes the unity of art and technology. Its primary characteristic, however, is its apparent lightness, even weightlessness. Breuer has created this impression by means of 3 elements: the exposure of the frame, the inconspicuousness of the seat, and the sheen of the nickel-plated steel tube. Among its other innovations are the runners, the continuous steel tubing which have replaced conventional chair legs. This was an absolutely revolutionary invention, and it formed the basis of Breuer's other designs for tubular steel furniture. Moreover, the tubular frame was not welded together but assembled using studs and screws. This made it easier to upholster the arms, back and seat with sewn and finished pieces of fabric. The chair was manufactured in small workshops in Dessau and marketed from the end of 1926 onwards by Standard Möbel, a Berlin-based company, as Model B3. Walter Gropius naturally found a place for it in his master's house in Dessau, which was seen as a showcase for Neues Wohnen, the new way of living. Parties were an important part of life at the Bauhaus from the very beginning. They served to foster a sense of community, diffuse conflicts and, of course, to promote contact between the school and the public. The festivities on the 18th of May were special because that was Walter Gropius's birthday. This collage was given to Gropius on his 44th birthday by Herbert Bayer. 2 years after graduating in mural painting, Bayer had been appointed to head the newly established Workshop for Typography and Advertising at the Bauhaus in Dessau. He introduced the standardization of all printing material according to DIN, the German industry standard, and put into practice a policy of using small initial letters that broke with the German conventions of capitalization. The newly introduced standardization is alluded to playfully in the title of the collage, The Mouth, 44 Tokens of Affection in DIN. And indeed the gigantic sheet can be folded up into the standard A4 format. It is covered in numerous prints from lips in blue, pink and black, like kisses from students and teachers. Some of them are accompanied by comments, like the one next to Bayer's own imprint, Hairs in Unwanted Places. Tiny numbers identify each of the well-wishers on name tags. The teachers and older students are listed under Normengrößen, or standard sizes, as stated on an attached slip of paper. They have obviously complied with the new system, as their signatures and lip prints are carefully lined up under each other. Things look quite different with the beginners, as the handwriting terms them. Their kisses and signatures tumble exuberantly out of an open envelope. The image, as well as the progress that they hope to make at the Bauhaus, are summed up in a single pithy phrase: from chaos to composition.
In 1928, Walter Gropius resigned from his post as director. As his successor, he proposed Hannes Meyer, a Swiss who'd run the architectural department of the Bauhaus for the previous year. Hannes Meyer placed emphasis on new aspects at the Bauhaus, and looking back in 1930, he wrote,
I taught the students the connection between building and society, the way from formal intuition to scientific building research, and the imperative, people's needs instead of luxury needs.
Whilst his oeuvre is not large, Meyer counts as one of the most important functionalists in the architecture of the 1920s. From 1928 to 1930, working together with Hans Witwer, he designed the School of the General German Trade Union Federation, built in Bernau near Berlin, which you see a model of here. This commission involved students from different years at the Bauhaus and several of its workshops, working together with external experts on a real project. This made it one of the high points of Bauhaus activity under Hannes Meyer's direction. The architecture of the Trade Union School is marked by clarity and simplicity. It's functional, fully thought out, and limited to what's necessary. Meyer developed his design in every respect as a social and spatial organism, in which trade union members could get to know each other quickly, study together, and live together, right down to the comprehensive sports and leisure facilities set in natural surroundings. The building complex is differentiated and inserted sensitively into the landscape in an exemplary manner. With a strict economy of means, Meyer has achieved high aesthetic quality, both in the ensemble as a whole and in the interior spaces provided to foster a sense of community.
Under Hannes Meyer as the new director of the Bauhaus, some of the teachers and students took the Soviet Union as their model. Town planning schemes were now linked to demands for social and political change. That said, Reinhold Rossig's diploma project, Design for a Socialist City, was something special even for the Bauhaus in 1931. Just to start with, the dimensions of the proposed town are enormous. It extends for hundreds of kilometres from Breslau to Berlin, as the small map at the bottom left shows. Rossig took the linear city as his model, with its roots in the Spanish and British ribbon developments of the late 19th century. These had usually grown up along transportation routes such as railway lines, main roads, canals and rivers. Although comparatively long, ribbon developments are not at all broad. Rossig's so-called socialist design is inspired by the idea of a collective lifestyle determined by the exigencies of industrial work. The city is separated into residential and industrial zones, which are aligned uniformly and connected by an underground train system to provide rapid transportation. Leisure activities take place in centrally located areas such as the main kitchen or collective spaces. An overhead railway facilitates long-distance travel to other cities. Town planning first appeared on the Bauhaus curriculum in 1927. The course was initially headed by Hannes Meyer, who handed it over to Ludwig Hilberseimer in 1929. Rossig's diploma scheme testifies to the enthusiasm for experimentation in town planning at the Bauhaus.
The Candem cane table lamp was made by two people, Hin Bredendijk and myself. We had it as a bedside lamp and as a table lamp. The base and the shade are the same in both cases, but the bedside lamp is lower and has a shorter arm. The important thing about the base was that the cable fitted well into it and that the ball of the joint sat well in it.
That's how Marianne Brandt, one of the Bauhaus's most important female designers, remembers the making of her Candem lamp in 1928. This desk lamp is a thorough reworking by Brandt and Bredendijk of a model produced by the Candem Company of Leipzig in 1925. The pair gave the reflector a closed form, bent the movable tubular arm to improve its functionality, and remodelled the base to increase its stability. The new flowing contours lent the lamp a much more elegant appearance. A new range of colours and an easy-to-use switch completed the transformation. The starting point for the subsequent triumph of the Bauhaus lamps was the spacious premises of the metal workshop in Dessau. As early as 1926, it was capable of manufacturing all of the lamps for the new Bauhaus building there. In the years that followed, the metal workshop increasingly developed into a design laboratory for new lamps, working in close cooperation with industry. The Candem Company began the mass production of Brandt and Bredendijk's innovative lamp in the very same year that they designed it. Only a few years later, more than 50,000 of these Bauhaus lamps had been sold. In a nutshell, Bauhaus wallpaper resulted from the aversion to wallpaper at the Bauhaus.
Recalls Hinek Scheper. He was first a student and then from 1925 onwards a teacher of mural painting at the Bauhaus. The avant-garde at the time rejected wallpaper out of hand because of its petit bourgeois connotations. The wallpaper manufacturer, Emil Rasch, was only able to persuade the Bauhaus director Hannes Meyer to enter into a joint venture with the argument that, as a cheaply produced industrial product, wallpaper was ideal precisely for the home of the average person. After all, Meyer had said that the Bauhaus should cater for people's needs instead of luxury needs. The contract signed between the Bauhaus and Rasch's company in 1929 turned out to be a success for both parties. Around 150 different wallpaper designs entered mass production. The wallpapers produced at the Bauhaus are generally neutral with a finely structured surface instead of decorative patterns. They were available in delicate pastel shades of ochre, blue and green. This made them perfectly suited to the new, sober style of interior furnishing promoted by the Bauhaus. In 1931, Jost Schmidt designed the cover of the Bauhaus wallpaper catalogue, and it makes a very strong statement. A roll of bright new wallpaper dispels the gloom of the old background. Resting on it is a crystal ball of sorts, which provides a glimpse into the future. In the curving reflection, we can make out an ideal modern living room. The wallpapers soon achieved great popularity and were an important source of income for the Bauhaus.
Marianne Brandt is best known as a designer of elegant metal objects. Her lamps, ashtrays and teapots are internationally renowned as exemplary of functional Bauhaus design. Far less known are the photomontages and collages that she made during the same period, around 40 works in which she analyses the main issues in politics and society with biting accuracy and occasional irony. Her photo collage from 1930, titled "With All 10 Fingers," is one of her simplest compositions. A fashionably dressed young woman is kneeling down with her head thrown back dramatically and her arms outstretched in an undefined space. She appears to hang from threads, which come together in the hand of a well-dressed older man above her in the distance. The woman has been degraded to the status of a marionette, wholly dependent on the man. The blank space between them further emphasizes the contrasts in terms of sex, age and power. The Bauhaus did not always make things easy for its female members. At the very beginning, admittedly, women made up almost half of the student intake, and many took on leading roles in the creative, intellectual and social life of the school. Marianne Brandt herself ran the metal workshop, at least for a while. In other respects, however, the Bauhaus was not so progressive. Only 1 year later, in 1920, the entrance requirements were changed to the effect that no more than a third of the students admitted to the beginners' classes could be women. Furthermore, most of the female students were assigned to workshops that were traditionally considered the preserve of women, such as weaving, ceramics and bookbinding. Women on the teaching staff also experienced discrimination, receiving a lower salary than their male colleagues. From 1929 onwards, Walter Peterhans ran the first photography course at the Bauhaus Typography and Advertising Workshop. The studies of material and structure that you see here, executed by Peterhans's students, give an idea of his teaching. Peterhans stressed the importance of working with the greatest possible precision. The depiction should become as one with the object. The surface structure and the grey tones were resolved so finely that the photographic image possesses an almost tactile quality. To this end, Peterhans's students received a rigorous systematic training with an emphasis on technical skills. The coursework included extensive lighting and material studies of simple and combined objects in the studio and in the open air, while the lessons covered physics, optics and the theory of translucent layers, as well as the chemical reactions involved in photographic processes. The differences between Peterhans's method and the conception of photography on the one hand, and those of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy on the other, could not have been greater. Peterhans resolutely rejected Moholy-Nagy's rather experimental photographs, his subjectivism, the suspension or abolition of perspective, and his affinity for abstraction. What Peterhans taught was applied photography, such as is practiced in advertising or photoreportage. The training his students received allowed many of them to work subsequently as professional photographers.
A red square glows in the midst of brown, green, violet and blue stripes, which develop a dynamic relationship. In spite of its abstract nature, Paul Klee's picture Fire in the Evening from 1929 gives an impression of depth and space, while resembling geological formations. Within Paul Klee's oeuvre, which encompasses more than 9,000 works, there are around 60 of these strip pictures in the form of drawings, etchings, or as here, coloured works. They display a controlled composition and a calculated combination of colours. Their basic component is a horizontal stripe, which can be seen as a layer. These are arranged regularly following what Klee called a dividual principle of organisation. He compared it to the regular beat in music. The vertical partitions, on the other hand, have an irregular arrangement, or in Klee's terms, individual principle of organisation. This corresponds to musical rhythm, which signifies a deviation from the musical beat. The coloured layer pictures in particular were produced after a journey to Egypt in the winter of 1928-29. They're artistic recollections that reflect the intensive atmosphere of a rural landscape. Klee noted,
"I want to make reality visible through painting."
Notwithstanding the fame of the artists who taught there, the Bauhaus did not see itself as an art academy at all. It wasn't until the autumn of 1926 that classes in free painting were introduced, at the instigation of Paul Klee, Wassily Kandinsky and Lionel Feininger. The influence of industrial production continued to grow at the expense of the fine arts, however, and in 1931 Paul Klee left the school. Wassily Kandinsky was the only one of the artists appointed in the Weimar era to remain at the Bauhaus until the end.
I want to create human types, not portraits. I want the essence of space, not interiors.
That's how the painter, sculptor and stage designer Oskar Schlemmer summarized his main subject, the relationship between space and the human form. This is clearly evident in his drawing titled Bauhaus Stairway. It's based on the main stairs of the Bauhaus building in Dessau, the white temple of modernism at which Schlemmer taught for a period of 4 years. Somewhat androgynous figures are shown walking upstairs while a single person descends. Schlemmer refrains from depicting individuals, showing most of them from behind and merely suggesting their profiles. Although the figures have smoothly curving outlines, they're constructed on vertical and horizontal lines that echo the strictly geometrical composition of the staircase and thus create a relationship with it. In September 1932, just 2 weeks before Schlemmer did this drawing, the town council of Dessau approved a motion brought by the National Socialists to close down the Bauhaus. In a letter, Schlemmer wrote,
"It is a scandal that the cultural world does not rise up and exercise its veto."
Schlemmer's own veto came in the form of this preliminary sketch, quickly followed by an oil painting of the same title. It's probably his most famous work. Everything that's laid out in the drawing is to be found here too, enhanced by the clear use of colour and the skillful treatment of light. The gradual dissolution of the steps in the drawing corresponds to the transparency of the upper staircase in the painting. Together with the figures progressing upstairs, it appears to symbolise the way to a bright future, namely modernism. On the other hand, it can also be seen as a sign of the transience of the Bauhaus. And the end was not long in coming. In 1933, the National Socialists seized power, and soon after managing to find new premises in Berlin, the Bauhaus was closed down permanently. In 1930, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe came to teach at the Bauhaus, next to Walter Gropius, perhaps the most important German architect of the 20th century. Mies was a master of restrained elegance. His style of building is characterized by a reduced, clear language of form. He said it all in 3 famous words.
Less is more.
By using steel columns to carry the structural load, Mies gained immense freedom to vary interior space and to make large areas of the facade almost entirely of glass. One of the best-known examples is his Barcelona pavilion, the interior of which is shown in this perspective drawing. Built as Germany's contribution to the 1929 International Exposition in Spain, the pavilion had no function other than a representational one. It illustrates Mie's concept of flowing space, of equilibrium between indoors and outdoors, openness and closure, and above all, between architecture and nature. Only fine materials were used: marble, travertine, onyx, and chrome-plated steel. The roof rests on slender chrome-plated steel columns, between which wall slabs and panes of glass rise from the floor to the ceiling. The transition between interior and exterior space is almost imperceptible. At the heart of the building is a wall of onyx stone. The interior has been left empty, apart from a few selected pieces of furniture. At Barcelona, Germany was allowed to take part in a World Fair for the first time since the First World War. It was an opportunity to demonstrate the sober, objective ethos of the new democratic system, alongside the capabilities of German industry and craftsmanship. Mie's revolutionary pavilion quickly became one of the main attractions at the Barcelona Expo, and it subsequently exerted a huge stylistic influence on modern architecture. Ludwig Mies van der Rohe's appointment as director in 1930 brought fundamental changes to the Bauhaus. It became primarily a school of architecture. The workshops for metal, joinery and mural painting were merged into an interior works department. The curriculum was reorganized as well. A course on building technology was followed by the study of various types of building and, as the final stage, an urban design scheme. One of Mies' principal themes was the harmonious interplay of exterior and interior space. The central focus of his teaching was the single-family house. According to Mies,
someone who can design such a house properly has also mastered all other kinds of architecture.
Mies developed a simple house type for the purpose of instruction, which this model of courthouses enables us to study. The flat-roofed buildings are mostly laid out in terraces. Instead of organising the lives of the inhabitants by assigning spaces to specific functions, the areas can be used in a variety of ways. As in the Barcelona pavilion, fully glazed facades allow interior and exterior spaces to merge. A wall now encloses the entire private area, both house and garden. The interior no longer opens onto the outside world, but onto a second interior environment within a clearly delimited territory.
The Bauhaus lies literally under the Nazi jackboot, as Nazi thugs and officials march over it, perhaps also towards a small group of young people who seem distressed, tense, and uncertain of where to go. Further back, a column of stormtroopers stands at the ready, an immeasurable paramilitary body that stretches to the horizon. At its feet lie human forms, but are these people seeking cover or already dead? Iwao Yamawaki's collage from December 1932 captures the end of the Bauhaus in a powerful and direct image. On the 22nd of August 1932, the Town Council of Dessau approved by a large majority a National Socialist proposal to close the Bauhaus. Ludwig Mies van der Rohe attempted yet another new start, this time in Berlin, where he ran the Bauhaus as a private school, financed by the licensing fees for manufacturing Bauhaus products. On the 11th of April 1933, the Berlin Bauhaus was raided by police on the pretext of searching for evidence that it was a hotbed of Bolshevism. Soon after that, the Rasch Wallpaper Company terminated its joint venture agreement with the Bauhaus, which deprived the school of its vital licensing income. 2 months later, the director of the Bauhaus was notified of the conditions under which the school could be reopened. All Jews must be excluded, while teachers were advised to join the National Socialist Party. The syllabus was also required to conform to National Socialist principles. The teaching staff gathered for a meeting on the 19th of July 1933, at which Mies reported on the hopeless financial and political situation. He then proposed a motion to close down the Bauhaus, which was approved by all of those present. It was a last demonstrative manifestation of intellectual independence. The ideas of the Bauhaus, however, could not be suppressed. They spread all over the world, thanks to its many international students. The teachers, such as Josef Albers, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, Walter Gropius, Marcel Breuer and Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, emigrated to the USA, where they continued their work in many different places, among them the new Bauhaus in Chicago. After the end of the Second World War, Bauhaus ideas returned to Germany, where they were developed further, in particular at the School of Design in the southern city of Ulm. The influence of the Bauhaus continues to this day. The products once created there have become epitomes of modern and yet timeless design, while its architectural heritage can hardly be overlooked, especially in today's Berlin.